it was a no-brainer for me this evening. I thought that I'd simply tell you one of the creepiest things that's happened to me. I've always been interested in the Second World War. My father taught the period, and I was a boy, and there was lots of books lying around, and both my grandfathers served, albeit for different sides, and I was especially interested in airmen because, these men would be in these new machines up there for these intense hours trying to kill each other, and then they'd be, home at the pub that night unable to talk about it. Talking about it amongst pilots is considered very bad luck, who've been a superstitious lot since the Red Baron. And, it was an order. They were ordered to not talk about it. No one wants to hear about it in the field or at home. But something happens when you're closer to death and you want to shed the last heaviest loads, I suppose. And I was an intrepid kid, which is another word for nosy. And to stop me accosting old men on trains asking them what they did during the war, my grandmother introduced me to a guy called Ivan Davies, who knew my grandfather and was an airman in a bomber crew during the Second World War and ran Legacy in Australia for quite a few years. And he and his wife, Mercy, introduced me to a whole list of airmen who, fortunately, most of them lived in the same sort of war pension retirement village of theirs, who were willing to talk to me. And I recorded a lot of incredible stories on my little dictaphone, and more importantly, perhaps for a 12-year-old, I got given heaps of cool stuff. Medals and coins and a photo of a Japanese woman with dried blood on it, and an Italian tank commander's helmet with Egyptian sand still in it, and letters and really treasured things. And they all went in a wooden fruit box under my bed. But Ivan Davies' story was the one that really snared me. Ivan was a 19-year-old WA farm boy co-piloting a Halifax bomber, which flew out of Suffolk and dropped bombs over, the Third Reich. And one night, smack in the middle of the war, his plane caught fire over occupied France. It was actually sabotaged, but it's a separate story. And the first person who jumps out of a Halifax that's going down over Nazi Europe is the Navigator, who folds up his stool and unscrews a hatch. Jumps out. The second is the co-pilot. And then there's 5 more people to squeeze through this little hatch with their parachutes after them. And the rear gunner knows he's a goner, And anyway, the only 2 people who got out of this Halifax were Ivan, the co-pilot, and his navigator, a guy called John. And they both saw the plane sort of blow up and get engulfed in flames and sort of just sail down into the night as they drifted apart in the darkness, which was, Ivan says on the tape, incredibly quiet after all that din. And they both, fortunately, very luckily, landed and found resistance farmers who took them in and hid them and fed them and passed them up something called the Comet Line, which was a resistance line that helped airmen get out of Europe via Belgium and eventually onto boats to neutral countries, hopefully. That was the idea. And even more incredibly, they found each other, which is really good for them because they've been friends since training. And although Ivan had the sort of the silk map that was sewn into his flight jacket, he knew no French, whereas John knew a little bit, and most importantly, had his navigator's compass, without which they just really couldn't survive. And so the first night of their reunion, they were hidden in an attic, and Ivan was really perturbed to find that John had secreted a bottle of wine. He was kind of peeved that he wasn't sharing it, and then really horrified to see him drink the whole thing. And the thing was that something had gone wrong with John. He'd hurt his leg in parachuting into a dry riverbed, and so his limp made him really conspicuous. And he was also in some kind of terrified shock. The crash had affected him completely differently. And this night he proceeded to get really drunk, fall asleep, and then started screaming in his sleep. And he couldn't be woken and stop because he was so rotten drunk. So the next morning, the family that was hiding them sort of kicked them out of the house in case they'd alerted the neighbours, and sort of threw them into the woods and made them go to the next rendezvous by themselves. And what followed was this really horrible journey where Ivan, had to keep this guy awake and quiet, and they passed, soldiers and farmers with dogs and Nazi cops and a lot of it, until they got to the next rendezvous, and they were staying in a barn and in a place called Crège. And the farmers, once again, these Frenchy farmers, brought out wine for them to drink. And Ivan said to John he really didn't want him to drink it and warned him. And of course, John drank and got drunk again and accused Ivan of wanting to kill him. And Ivan was 19. and really scared. So that night when he was asleep, he made this decision, and he split the bread and left John with the silk map. But in a move that I think plagued Ivan till he died in 1998, he stole John's compass. And navigators are really attached to their compasses. And Ivan luckily used the compass and bravely to go up the Comet Line, and it took 9 months before he was back in England. And I have all his notes that he wrote for the Special Operations Branch when he got there. But 2 nights later, he was only 5 miles north of where he abandoned John in a place called Chevron. And in his notes, it just said, stayed night in Chevron. But what he told me, and I've got on this tape, is that in the middle of the night sometime, he was in another attic in a village, and he woke up and John's face was right there in the dark on top of him. And he felt a weight over his entire body and couldn't breathe and was choking. And he said his mouth was full of wine. And that's what it says on the tape. He says it really quite simply, my mouth was full of wine. And he was convinced that John was in the room. And then as dawn broke, it revealed that there was no one in the room at all. And it wasn't until years after the war when he was back in WA and he used his legacy contacts to find out that the same night that he had this visitation, John was caught by the Gestapo and shot in a farm, and along with the family that were hiding him. And I remember as a kid, and you can hear it on the tape, just being incredibly relieved that Ivan hadn't killed him in the barn. I thought that was where the story was going to go. I mean, I was creeped out by the visitation and everything. But I just remember being really relieved. And it was also kind of creeped out because Ivan sounded so guilty, and he'd waited till his wife Mercy had left to go and do some errands to tell me the story in their kitchen. And the older I've got, the more I truly believe that I think I'm the only person he told the story to. But anyway, then he did something which I didn't feel right even then, and he gave me John's compass. And he showed me how if you put it near a power point, it span by itself. And whenever there was a declination in weather pressure, it would spin by itself. And he said, just, store it out of the way. And so I went in the fruit box with my other stuff. And sure enough, when someone used power in the house, turned lights on, or when there was really low pressure system, you could hear this thing spinning through the leather case that it was in with John's initials on it, and through the box and through my mattress. And whenever other mates had come over, I'd show it to them and play Ivan's sort of creepy tape. And I basically gave myself nightmares, and I thought that John was, going to come in and sit on my chest at night. So my parents quite wisely took the box and put it in the attic, where it stayed for 20 years. And this Christmas, I went back. My parents are separating, and so I go through all the stuff, the attic stuff, and I found the compass. And it's got his initials on it, and I'll go there. And I remembered it all suddenly. I remembered the whole thing. I'd forgotten about it. And so I brought it back to Sydney, where I live, with a couple of other choice pieces to put on my shelf. And I showed my flatmate it and couldn't get it to spin by itself. And he didn't really like it from the word go. I think he finds all that stuff quite creepy. But then the next day after I got back, it went missing. And we searched high and low for it, and eventually ended up accusing a friend's kid of stealing it. It was really embarrassing. And then it was only this, sometime in winter I was reorganising my shelves, and I found it behind the books. And I chastised myself for not having looked there, but then my flatmate said he had looked there, but obviously not well enough, and so on. 2 weeks later, so I put it back on the shelf with my tank helmet and my my D-Day pack of Lucky Strikes. And 2 weeks later, I went to show it to someone, and it was gone again. And I freaked out and left the house, actually. It was evening. I just walked out and went back later with my girlfriend and looked for it, and it was behind the books again. And I instantly just sort of put it in a shoebox with some stuff and put it in my cupboard in my bedroom. And that night, at least I thought I could hear the fucking thing spinning again. So I got up and I put it, the shoebox in the laundry with my flatmate's fishing stuff. And that's basically, where it lives. And when I knew I was going to talk about it tonight, a couple of weeks ago, I went and checked on it, and it was there, which was sort of a minor relief. And then I got my mum to send over the tapes, with sort of little, Bakelite briefcase that I had all these dictaphone tapes in, and they came on Monday. And the tape of me talking to Ivan, which is creepy enough to listen to after 20 years, I wasn't the best interviewer, as a 12-year-old or what it was, it cuts out halfway through it. Ivan's talking about the night when he sort of abandoned John, and the tape is just wiped, and none of the other tapes are wiped in it. And anyway, so I started getting really creeped out, and last night I put it out on the table with my overnight bag and stuff on the kitchen table. And this morning I came down on the stairs and it just wasn't on the table, and I froze. And it was on the ground under the table. And I really started getting the jeebies about it, especially about flying with it today here. And my girlfriend and I actually had a spat about it. She said, "Why can't you just take the case? You know, like, they won't know." But I did, and it was a really hairy flight, not without its turbulence. And I tell you what, it really spins at 30,000 feet. It just goes nuts. And I was on the... my flatmate doesn't want it in the house. You know, I don't really like it. And I was at the airport, getting a cab here, sort of doing some final research on my iPhone, sort of investigating the protocol for pilots that are shot down these days. And I read this phrase that said, the pilot must keep his map and his compass concealed at all times. And I just had this wave in the cab here that the thing doesn't want to, you know, be out in the open, that it needs to be concealed and needs to be hidden. And I'm putting it back in its box. I mean, that's where it's going to go. But I don't really know what to do with it, especially as I get closer to death.
Hi, I'm Nick, and this is the story of how I got my groove back. Let me, if I may, create for you, if I can, a time machine of words hovering before you. Everybody in? No pushing. Now let's go back to a time which I call my black period. Oh, here we are. I know, fast. Now look at the me of that time. Yes, I had both legs then. But emotionally, I didn't have a leg to stand on. I was also obese. I had my back against a flapping barn door in a tornado, and inside the barn were hundreds of itty-bitty baby chicks, all relying on me to protect them. That's a metaphor, but that's how I felt 24/7. Imagine a barn full of chickens in peril, and you've got a window into my existence. And I wouldn't blame you for pulling down the blind. What's more, my wife had just left me. And by left me, I mean she'd been hit by a car. During our relationship, I'd ignored the disparity of our loves. My love for her was like the love a teenage girl feels for a horse, meaning I would lay down my life for her. And her love for me was like the love a horse feels for a teenage girl, meaning she didn't care if I lived or died. I didn't blame her. The amount of her father's money I spent on ringtones, I would have left me too if I could. My friend Lulu offered me her holiday house. So I got on my motorbike, filled the sidecar with booze and pornography, and split. I arrived at the house, or shack as it turned out to be, the wind shaking me like a nanny, the trees headbanging like dickheads at a party where the theme is the 90s. I slammed the door against the tempest, jumpy as a frog. Turns out I'd been waiting to exhale, so I exhaled. I took off my coat, I struck a match, I lit a candle, and in the quavering half-light, I saw something cloaked in darkness on the couch, bigger than a man, horribly solemn and without a man's shape. I know with bears you should act nonchalantly, as the frogs say, because freaking out is akin to saying dinner's ready. So I decided to play this game cool. Oh, hey there. Can I get you something to drink? I was just going to get a... Yeah, okay. It regarded me with a terrible blankness, its moth eyes like blown glass full of oil, its good posture like that of a geisha. A geisha from hell. The bulbous head swiveled as I hurried over to the sink. Surreptitiously, I looked at my cell phone. No reception. Quelle surprise, Vodafone. I lit more candles. The big shadow of the fiend bobbed up and down on the wall. All these candles. Don't worry, not trying to seduce you or anything. I laughed nervously. Behind my jack-o'-lantern grin was a brain going over its options. If it's Bigfoot, it can be outsmarted and will fear fire. If it's a mutant, it may have super strength, but it's not invincible. If it's the Reaper, prolong the small talk and don't touch any part of it. If it's the devil, make a bargain. If it's an alien, use a mirror to deflect its lasers. What I knew for sure was that I had to wound it enough for me to run away, and so it would need to be very wounded, because as I said, I was quite fat at the time. I poured whiskey into 2 mugs and threw a spoon on the ground. Oh, bloody hell, just drop the spoon. I'll get a new one from under the sink because that's where they are. I prayed to my God, the God of atheism and terrifying situations, and opened the cupboard. Huzzah, rat poison. Nothing like a nice soothing drink at the end of the day, am I right? I queried, calling on the acting skills I'd honed in the Year 9 production of Away. I stirred the poison into his drink, then I slid a big knife up my sleeve and carried the mugs back to him. Cheers, I said, and we drank. That's not going to be enough poison, thought my mind. Don't you think I know that? I retorted mentally. You have to believe in me or no one will. Another? I asked the monster. Go on, I assume you're unemployed, so... Okay, great. Another round. More poison. And blame it on the whiskey, but I opened up to that guy. I told him about Pauline, my ex-wife, about the IVF and the ringtone debt and the weight gain and the hopelessness that had rushed into me like so much apathy water into a despair dam. White-hot terror aside, the thing was a really good listener. I was ranting because I was afraid, but also because I had things I had to say. But like the saying goes, you can't rant forever, and soon the silence returned, like a recording of the silence from an ancient crypt turned up very loud. You could cut the tension with a knife, which reminded me to cut the creature with a knife. So on the 7th round, as it tilted its head back to drink and I screamed, "Salut!" I leapt forward and plunged the knife into its midsection, right up to the handle, crying, "Yah!" It didn't move. We were suddenly very close, looking right into each other's eyes, and I was embarrassed. I yanked the knife to the right, slitting the stomach open. No reaction. I stabbed again and again, in the chest, in the neck, in the shoulders of the brute, until the blade snapped off in its forearm. I was slick with blood, euphoric and panting, making a kind of yah, yah, yah noise. It stared at me, motionless. I was about to resume stabbing when the gaping stomach twitched. I could just make out a cavity behind the skin, and there, tiny, shiny eyes, mewling halflings in the gut who didn't like the light. Pink and peach and lemon. Good grief. Are they Care Bears? I reeled, struck like a bell with guilt, my wickedness tolling over the land. Criminal, criminal, criminal. The barn doors were open and all the chickens were dead. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I said, backing away, tripping over the coffee table and swinging floorwards in a bloody arc. An explosion of colour, then blackness. The loping thing took me semi-conscious to the water's edge, lay me in a rowboat and pushed us out to sea. He's gonna drown me like Naomi Watts in that horrific but very good movie Funny Games, I thought. Minutes or hours passed. When I woke again, the thing was sitting at the bow, the boat low in the still water. The Care Bears were at its sides. They watched me in the moonlight. A satellite blinked behind them, and I knew we were high up too, over fish and trolleys and maybe a dugong. Then one of the Care Bears, who I know now was Jamaican, pulled a little bone harp from the stomach and began to play. My finger in the water was a gramophone needle. I leaned in, and before I knew what was what, my entire head was inside its mouth. There in the wet blackness, my life didn't so much flash before my eyes as collapse backwards into itself, contracting like a constellation into a tiny grain of glowing sand. All the different versions of me yanked out of their scenarios as if on wires. I was falling up and getting younger, and with my eyes shut against the roaring prism, I felt my adult teeth and then my baby teeth sink into the bone of my jaw under the gums, and I knew in a moment I'd be dwindling in the womb, blown back into the blood like sand. And I know how it sounds, but all I thought was que sera. Not because I had given up, but because I was happy to have been here at all. Then the creature opened its mouth and gently expelled me. I was the perfect temperature, and I didn't hate Pauline anymore. I was full of pity and luck. We came ashore, and the beast and I linked arms against the night. The Care Bears tumbling and prancing like gypsy children who distract you so their parents can steal your wallet. And all around, the smell of death going down on life, really gagging on life and loving it. And on the wind, an owl screech, and the owl talons around a mouse who was thinking to itself, oh no, no more sex. And the mouse head off and bloody, and the bloody beak of the owl lit up by sunlight bouncing off the moon, bouncing off the sea, and the owl thinking, good, this mouse in my beak will sustain me for more sex. While in the wet, clicky, hooping, murderous, lecherous night, the fragile and the hulking things, moonwoke, swollen and drunk, set their spores to the air and send out their couriers of lust and lay down their love lures and lick their chops. The sun is a cat, and the cat's away. FYI, when, by the dawn, that husband mouse still hasn't come home, the wife mouse doesn't flip out, doesn't slide down the tiny cupboard, throw in the towel. She's too hungry, too scared, too busy. What good could self-pity do her? I'm going to take a leaf out of her tiny book, I thought. The thing walked me back to the shack and then squatted so the Care Bears could clamber back into its stomach. I knew it was leaving, and I knew in the days to come I'd forget everything that had happened, or not believe it. I guess it could read minds, because it pulled the Care Bear out of its stomach, held it kicking above the ground, then lasers came out of its eyes and the Care Bear burst into flames. In the ashes was a locket with the monster's picture in it. Thanks, I said. But it had already lumbered away into the trees. And that's the story of how I got my groove back.